The roar of tires screeched in the dealership parking lot as Derek Williams stormed out, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. His fists were clenched, not in anger, but in sheer disbelief. Behind him, Greg Sanders, the dealership manager, stood firm by the glass door, his smug grin a mask for the venom that had just dripped from his words. "You people are always wasting time," Greg spat with a scoff, loud enough for the sparse crowd to hear. "This place is for serious buyers only." The words echoed in Derek's ears, branding his humiliation in front of curious eyes that pretended not to see. Derek froze halfway to his car. It wasn't about the car anymore. It wasn't about the money either. It was about something Greg never saw coming, something that was about to flip his world upside down. Derek turned back slowly, his face a mixture of calm and fire. "You're going to regret this," Derek said, his voice low and steady, almost too quiet to hear. Greg laughed. "Yeah? We'll see," Greg retorted dismissively, turning back to the showroom with an air of finality. But Greg didn't know who Derek really was, what power he held, or the shocking truth that would soon unravel every smug fiber of his being. Earlier that day, Derek had started his morning with an optimism he hadn't felt in weeks. After years of hard work, late nights, and grinding, he'd finally decided it was time to treat himself. He had his eyes set on a sleek black sedan, the kind that made heads turn. It was more than just a car. It was a symbol of how far he'd come, a gift to himself after years of sacrifice. He had already done his research and knew the dealership he wanted to visit. He wore his best button-up shirt and a crisp pair of jeans. He felt good. Greg Sanders, on the other hand, was having a miserable day. A deal with a high-profile client had fallen through, and now he was on edge, barking orders at his employees. Known for his sharp tongue and cutting remarks, Greg had earned himself a reputation as a man who didn't tolerate nonsense, or people he thought were beneath him. That morning, as he adjusted his tie in his office mirror, he made a silent vow. No more time wasters today. When Derek walked into the dealership, he was met with the sight of shiny cars glistening under bright showroom lights. The atmosphere smelled like polished leather and coffee. A young salesman greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. Looking for anything in particular?" the salesman asked. "Yes," Derek replied confidently. "I've got my eye on the new Maxima. I'd like to take a closer look." The salesman's eyes lit up. "Great choice. Let me grab the keys and—" "Hold up!" Greg's voice cut through the room like a whip. He approached, his jaw tight and his expression unreadable. "I'll take it from here," he said to the salesman, who immediately stepped aside, unsure of what was going on. Derek extended his hand to introduce himself. "Hi, I'm Derek." But Greg didn't take it. Instead, his eyes swept Derek from head to toe in a way that made Derek's smile falter. "Do you even know how much that car costs?" Greg asked, crossing his arms. Derek frowned, confused. "Yes, I do. I've done my research." Greg chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Sure you have. Listen, we don't have time for joyrides. If you're not ready to put some cash down, this isn't the place for you." The words stung. Derek felt a wave of heat rise to his face. He glanced around. A few customers and employees had stopped to watch. He felt small, exposed. "I'm serious about buying," Derek said firmly. "I'd like to discuss financing options." "Financing?" Greg sneered. "Look, let's not waste each other's time. If you can't pay up front, this conversation is over." It wasn't just the words. It was the way Greg said them, dripping with condescension, laced with something more sinister. Derek realized then what this was really about. He looked Greg in the eyes. "I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not going to stand here and let you insult me." Greg smirked. "My problem is time wasters like you. I can smell them a mile away." The humiliation was unbearable. Derek turned on his heel and walked out, but as he reached the parking lot, he stopped. Something inside him wouldn't let him just leave. Not like this. He thought about the years he spent clawing his way up, about the values his parents instilled in him. He wasn't going to let a man like Greg Sanders decide his worth. Derek turned back to the glass door, his reflection staring back at him like a challenge. Greg stood just inside, still smirking. Derek clenched his jaw and walked back toward the dealership, his heart pounding. "You're going to regret this," Derek said, his voice firm. You have no idea who I am? Greg laughed again, a hollow sound that seemed to carry too far in the quiet showroom. Oh yeah? What are you, some big-shot lawyer? A doctor? Spare me the story. Derek didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Greg shaking his head in amusement. As Derek drove off, his mind raced with plans. He wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. And little did Greg know, Derek wasn't just anybody. He was someone who had the power to change everything, for better or worse. The afternoon sun was sinking lower in the sky when Greg received an unexpected phone call. His assistant poked her head into his office, looking unusually flustered. Greg, she said nervously, there's a call for you on line 2. It's urgent. Greg frowned. Who is it? She hesitated. It's someone from... But before she could finish, the look on her face made Greg snatch the phone from his desk. Yeah, this is Greg Sanders. Who's calling? There was a pause, then a voice on the other end that made Greg's blood run cold. It was the beginning of the end for him, though he didn't know it yet. Greg gripped the phone tightly, his confidence slipping for the first time all day. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, and unmistakably authoritative. This is Amanda Hayes, Senior Vice President at Whitmore Investments, the voice said. Am I speaking to Greg Sanders, manager of Summit Auto Dealership? Greg's face went pale. Whitmore Investments. The name was well known in the industry, one of the largest venture capital firms in the country, with ties to major auto manufacturers and dealerships nationwide. They had the kind of influence that could make or break a business in seconds. Greg cleared his throat. Yes, this is Greg Sanders, he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. What can I do for you? There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that made Greg's palms sweat. Mr. Sanders, we received a very serious complaint about your dealership, specifically regarding your treatment of a customer earlier today, Amanda said, her tone sharp. Greg's mind reeled. A complaint? From Whitmore Investments? How is that even possible? His thoughts flashed back to Derek, the man he'd dismissed and humiliated. But no, that couldn't be it. Derek didn't look like someone who had connections to people like Amanda Hayes. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm not sure what you're referring to, Greg said, trying to mask the panic creeping into his voice. Could you clarify? I think you know exactly what I'm referring to, Amanda replied coldly. A man named Derek Williams. Do you remember him? Greg felt his stomach drop. Derek Williams. The name was starting to sound heavier with every passing second. Yes, I recall speaking with Mr. Williams, Greg admitted cautiously. But there must be some misunderstanding. He came in to look at a car, but he didn't seem like a serious buyer. Amanda's tone grew icier. Not a serious buyer? Do you know who Derek Williams is, Mr. Sanders? Greg hesitated, unsure of what to say. No, he admitted. Should I? The silence on the other end felt like an anvil hanging over his head. Derek Williams is one of Whitmore Investments' key partners, Amanda said finally. He's a self-made entrepreneur with a portfolio of successful businesses, and he's directly responsible for several of our recent acquisitions. He was considering purchasing a fleet of vehicles from your dealership for one of his companies. But thanks to your behavior today, he's not only decided against that, but he's also filed a formal complaint with us. And trust me, Mr. Sanders, we take this kind of thing very seriously. Greg's face turned bright red, his confidence now completely shattered. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Sanders? Amanda pressed. Greg stammered. I had no idea who he was. If I'd known. You shouldn't need to know someone's name or status to treat them with basic respect, Amanda interrupted sharply. Your behavior today wasn't just unprofessional. It was unacceptable. We expect better from the businesses we associate with. Greg's mind raced, searching for a way to salvage the situation. Ms. Hayes, please, he said, his voice tinged with desperation. There must be something I can do to make this right. That's not for me to decide, Amanda said curtly. Mr. Williams has the final say on whether or not Whitmore continues to do business with your dealership. I suggest you think long and hard about how you're going to address this situation. Good day, Mr. Sanders. The line went dead. Greg slumped back in his chair, his head spinning. The weight of Amanda's words pressed down on him, like a boulder. He could lose everything, his job, his reputation, his future in the industry. And all because of one man. One man he had dismissed and humiliated without a second thought. He felt a surge of anger. How was he supposed to know who Derek Williams was? The guy didn't walk in flashing his wealth or status. He looked like any other customer. Greg's fists clenched. This wasn't fair. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about fairness. It was about his own arrogance and the consequences he now faced. Meanwhile, Derek sat in his home office, his phone buzzing with messages from colleagues and friends who had heard about the incident. News traveled fast in his circles, especially when it involved someone like him. Derek wasn't one to seek revenge, but this time felt different. The humiliation he'd endured at the dealership wasn't just a personal slight. It was a symptom of a larger problem. And Derek knew he had the power to make a statement. He opened his laptop and began drafting an email. It wasn't just to Whitmore Investments. It was to every major contact in his network, business leaders, media outlets, and advocacy groups. He detailed his experience at the dealership, making sure to highlight Greg's dismissive and condescending behavior. He didn't embellish or exaggerate. The facts were damning enough on their own. By the time he hit send, Derek felt a sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he had taken a stand. And that was enough for now. The next day, the fallout began. Greg arrived at the dealership to find a flurry of activity. Employees whispered in hushed tones, glancing at him nervously as he passed. His assistant handed him a stack of papers with a grim expression. "What's this?" Greg asked, flipping through the pages. "It's coverage," she said hesitantly. "The story about Mr. Williams has gone viral." Greg's heart sank as he skimmed the headlines. Entrepreneur humiliated at local dealership. Manager's actions spark outrage. Whitmore partner speaks out on discrimination in the auto industry. Summit Auto faces backlash after shocking incident. The articles included quotes from Derek's email, as well as statements from other customers who claimed to have experienced similar treatment at the dealership. Social media was ablaze with calls to boycott Summit Auto, and hashtags like #RespectMatters and #BoycottSummit were trending nationwide. Greg's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, none of them good. His boss, the dealership owner, had left him multiple voicemails, each one angrier than the last. Greg's hands shook as he read comment after comment, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. He knew he needed to act fast, but he also knew it might already be too late. By the end of the day, Greg's worst fears were realized. His boss called him into the office and didn't mince words. "You've brought nothing but shame to this dealership," the owner said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Effective immediately, you're fired." Greg tried to argue, but the owner cut him off. "Save it. You've embarrassed us, and now we're paying the price. Pack your things and get out." Greg left the dealership that evening with a box of his belongings and a crushing sense of defeat. His once promising career was in ruins, and the man he had dismissed so easily was the one responsible. But for Derek, this was just the beginning of his mission to bring attention to an issue much bigger than himself. And while Greg's downfall was a victory of sorts, Derek knew the real fight was only just beginning. Greg sat in his car outside the dealership, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His career, his entire reputation was gone in an instant. Just the day before, he had walked these same halls with confidence, issuing orders, treating people however he pleased. Now he was just another man out of a job, drowning in his own mistakes. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced at the screen, his wife, Susan. He hesitated before answering. "Hey," he said, trying to sound normal. "Greg, what's going on?" Susan's voice was frantic. "I just saw the news. Your name is everywhere. People are calling you racist, a bigot. I don't understand. What happened?" Greg exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't told her yet. He had hoped he could fix things before she found out. "It's all blown out of proportion," he said quickly. "Some guy came in looking at cars. He didn't look serious, so I told him as much. Now he's ruining my life." There was a long silence on the other end. "Greg," Susan said slowly, "this isn't just some guy. You humiliated Derek Williams. Do you even realize who he is?" Greg gritted his teeth. Yeah, I get it now. But how was I supposed to know? That's the problem, Greg. Susan shot back. Why did it matter who he was? Why did you assume he wasn't serious? Do you know how bad this looks? Greg didn't respond. He knew the answer. Susan sighed. I've been getting calls from my friends. Our kid's school is even talking about it. You need to fix this. Greg knew she was right. But how? Derek Williams had money, power, and influence. Greg had nothing left except a ruined name. And it was about to get worse. Across town, Derek was seated in his office, phone in hand, reading the hundreds of messages flooding his inbox. Some were from business associates expressing their support. Others were from media outlets wanting interviews. And then there were the messages from strangers, people sharing their own stories of discrimination, thanking him for speaking up. He had no idea his email would spark such a firestorm. But he wasn't surprised. This kind of thing happened all the time. It had just never been caught on such a public scale before. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. He recognized the number immediately. Derek, it's Amanda, came the voice on the other end. Hey, Amanda, he greeted. I take it you saw the headlines? Saw them? Derek, you've set the internet on fire. Summit Auto is in crisis mode. And Greg Sanders? He's been fired. Derek leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He should have felt victorious, but something about it didn't sit right. You okay? Amanda asked. Yeah, Derek said. I didn't expect it to blow up this fast. Well, it did, Amanda said. And people are looking to you for the next move. Derek exhaled slowly. I don't want this to just be about one guy losing his job. That doesn't change anything in the bigger picture. Then make it bigger, Amanda suggested. Turn this into something that actually makes a difference. Derek thought about it for a moment. Maybe Amanda was right. Maybe this was an opportunity to create real change. Set up a meeting, he said finally. I want to talk to the dealership owner. And I want to see Greg Sanders face to face. Greg wasn't expecting the knock at his door that night. After the disastrous day, he had returned home, barely touching his dinner as Susan paced the kitchen, talking about damage control. Then came the knock, firm, deliberate. Susan glanced at Greg, then at the door. Are you expecting someone? No, Greg muttered, standing up cautiously. He walked to the door and peered through the peephole. His stomach clenched. Standing on the porch was Derek Williams. Greg's heart pounded. He hesitated before opening the door. Derek's expression was unreadable. Mind if we talk? Derek asked. Greg hesitated, then stepped aside. Susan watched from the kitchen, her arms crossed tightly. Derek walked in, glancing around before turning back to Greg. I'm going to be straight with you. What happened at the dealership wasn't just about you and me. It's about something much bigger. Greg scoffed. Look, I already lost my job. Isn't that enough for you? Derek's eyes narrowed. This was never about revenge, Greg. This is about accountability. Do you even understand why what you did was wrong? Greg clenched his jaw. I didn't know who you were. If I had... Stop right there, Derek interrupted. That's exactly the problem. You shouldn't have to know someone's name or bank account before treating them with respect. Do you get that? Greg opened his mouth, but hesitated. For the first time, he truly had no defense. Derek continued. What you did wasn't just about me. It's about every person who walks into places like that and gets treated like they don't belong. And I guarantee you, I wasn't the first person you dismissed like that. Greg swallowed hard. He wanted to argue. He wanted to push back. But the truth sat heavy in his chest. What do you want from me? Greg asked finally. Derek studied him for a moment. A real conversation. Not just for you, but for people like you who think the way you do. Because this doesn't end with just you losing your job. If you really want to fix things, you need to be part of the change. Greg's hands curled into fists. And if I say no? Derek's expression didn't change. Then you're exactly the man everyone thinks you are. Greg's jaw tightened. He had spent his whole life climbing to the top, only to lose it all in a matter of hours. Now he was being given a choice. The next words out of his mouth would change his life forever. And he had no idea what to say. Greg's living room felt unbearably tense, the weight of Derek's words pressing down on him. He had never been the kind of man to reflect on his actions. He had always believed that the strong pushed forward while the weak made excuses. But now, Standing in front of the man he had humiliated just hours ago, Greg was forced to confront something he had never truly considered: himself. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with both hands. So what? You wanted to go on TV and apologize? Write some public statement saying I've seen the error of my ways? Derek didn't flinch. I don't care about an apology, Greg. Apologies don't change anything. What I care about is action. Greg scoffed. And what exactly does that mean? It means using this as a moment to do something real, Derek said, crossing his arms. Because let me tell you something, you're not the only one who's ever done this. You're just the one who got caught. And you have two choices right now. You can crawl into a hole and pretend none of this happened, or you can face it head on. Greg sneered. And if I don't? Derek's face remained impassive. Then this story will just keep going. The internet isn't going to forget what you did, Greg. Every job interview, every opportunity, it'll all lead back to this. Susan, who had remained silent in the kitchen, spoke up for the first time. He's right, she said quietly. You can't just act like this didn't happen, Greg. If you don't do something, this will define you. Greg turned to his wife in disbelief. Are you actually taking his side? Susan folded her arms. I'm taking the side of reality. And reality is you screwed up? Greg looked between Derek and his wife, feeling cornered. He had spent years building his reputation. He had considered himself a leader, a businessman who commanded respect. Now, he was a cautionary tale, a name that people whispered with scorn. He took a shaky breath. What do you want me to do? Derek studied him for a moment, then pulled out his phone. Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting with the dealership owner to discuss a diversity and accountability initiative. You gonna be there? Greg's stomach twisted. Why? He already fired me. Because this isn't just about your job, Derek said. This is about making sure this doesn't happen again. Not just at Summit Auto, but at dealerships across the country. You're gonna sit in that meeting and listen. And if you're serious about fixing this, you're going to help. Greg let out a humorless laugh. And if I don't? Derek pocketed his phone. Then I walk out that door, and the next time you hear my name, it'll be when your face is all over the news again. The threat was subtle, but Greg knew it was real. Derek wasn't bluffing. Greg let out a slow breath. Fine, he muttered. I'll be there. Derek nodded. Good. He turned toward the door but stopped before stepping out. You think this is just about you, Greg. But it's not. You're just the beginning. Then he left. The next morning, Greg sat stiffly in the conference room of Summit Auto, feeling more like an intruder than someone who had once ruled this place. His former employees walked past the glass windows, stealing glances at him, whispering. The dealership owner, Mark Hastings, sat at the head of the table, his expression tight. I hope you understand why I fired you, Greg, he said bluntly. Greg nodded, avoiding his boss's eyes. Mark sighed. Look, I'm not going to pretend I didn't know you could be harsh, but I didn't realize it was this bad. And now, thanks to you, my dealership is under fire. Customers are pulling out. I have to do something. Derek leaned forward. That's why we're here. A woman sitting beside Derek cleared her throat. She was a middle-aged black woman in a sharp blazer, with an air of authority that commanded the room. My name is Angela Reynolds, she said. I work with an organization that specializes in anti-bias training for corporations. We're proposing a partnership with Summit Auto, not just to clean up this mess, but to actually change the way this dealership does business. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mark frowned. What exactly would this entail? Angela opened a folder and slid a document across the table. We're talking about real accountability, mandatory training, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and a reporting system for employees and customers. This isn't just about optics. This is about making sure that what happened with Mr. Williams never happens again. Mark rubbed his chin. And what do you need from me? Your commitment, Angela said. And your funding? Greg could see the hesitation on Mark's face. Let me make this clear, Derek added. If you don't act, this dealership will suffer. You may have fired Greg, but that's not enough. People want to see change. And if they don't, they'll take their business elsewhere. Mark exhaled sharply. Fine, I'll do it. But Greg, why is he here? Derek glanced at Greg. Because he's going to be part of this. Greg's head snapped up. Wait, what? Derek leaned back. You said you wanted to fix this. That means facing it. If you're serious, you'll work with Angela's team. You'll go through the training, just like the rest of the staff. And you'll speak to people about what you did, about why it was wrong. Greg felt a pit form in his stomach. You want me to stand up in front of people and what? Confess? Angela met his eyes. No, we want you to learn. And if you actually learn, then yeah, you're going to tell people about it. Greg looked around the room, realizing he was truly out of options. He could walk away now, leave this mess behind, and spend the rest of his life as the man who lost everything because he couldn't treat people with respect. Or he could face it. He exhaled through his nose. Fine, he muttered. I'll do it. Derek didn't smile. He simply nodded. Then let's get to work. Hours later, as Greg walked out of the dealership, his mind was spinning. He had spent years thinking he had it all figured out, that he was on top, that he understood the world. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been blind all along. His phone buzzed. A message from Susan. Did you do the right thing? Greg stared at the words for a long time before typing back. I don't know, but I think I'm about to find out. He hit send, staring at his reflection in the car window. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The morning air was thick with anticipation as Greg walked into the training facility downtown. It was nothing like the dealership. No polished cars, no eager salesmen. Just a plain conference room with rows of chairs, a whiteboard, and a projector screen displaying the words. Unpacking Bias. A workshop on accountability and change. Greg clenched his jaw as he took a seat at the back. He wasn't sure why he even showed up. Maybe it was because he had no other options. Maybe it was because of Susan's insistence. Or maybe, deep down, he was starting to realize that Derek was right about everything. People trickled in, some whispering as they recognized him. He wasn't just an attendee. He was the guy from the news, the one who got fired, the one who sparked all of this. Angela Reynolds, the workshop leader, entered the room, followed closely by Derek. They both glanced at Greg, but didn't acknowledge him right away. Instead, Angela clapped her hands together and began. Welcome, everyone. You're here today because we all have a responsibility to ourselves, to our communities, and to the people we serve. This isn't about blame. It's about understanding how bias works, how it shapes the way we interact with people, and most importantly, how we can change. Greg sighed, already feeling defensive. Angela continued. I want to start with a simple exercise. I'm going to show you a few photos, and I want you to write down the first words that come to mind. No filters, no second-guessing. Just your immediate gut reaction. The first photo flashed on the screen. It was a well-dressed white man in a suit. Greg wrote down, successful, confident, trustworthy. The next photo was a young black man in casual clothes, standing on a city street. Greg hesitated. His pen hovered over the paper. He glanced around. Some people were writing immediately, while others seemed just as stuck as he was. Then, reluctantly, he wrote, uncertain, risky, maybe dangerous. His stomach twisted as he read his own words. The photos kept coming. A woman in a business suit, an elderly man in a grocery store, a group of teenagers with hoodies. Each time, Greg forced himself to be honest. And each time, he saw something he didn't like. When the exercise was over, Angela walked to the front of the room. Now, I want you to look at your list, she said. Ask yourself, where did these thoughts come from? Who taught you to think this way? Because here's the truth. No one is born with bias. We learn it. And if we can learn it, we can unlearn it. Greg shifted in his seat. He hated to admit it, but she was right. He had never thought about it before. How his entire worldview had been shaped by things he never questioned. Angela turned to Derek. Mr. Williams, would you like to share? Derek nodded and stood. His eyes met Greg's for a brief moment before he addressed the room. What happened at Summit Auto wasn't new for me, Derek said. It wasn't the first time I walked into a place and was judged before I even opened my mouth. And it won't be the last. But what made that day different was the fact that I could actually do something about it. Most people can't. Most people just have to take it, day after day, knowing that no matter what they do, they'll never be seen the same way. Greg swallowed hard. Derek continued. This workshop isn't about making anyone feel guilty. It's about opening our eyes to what's been in front of us the whole time. And it's about figuring out how we can do better. Not because we have to, but because we should. The room was silent. Angela nodded. Thank you, Derek. Now let's talk about real solutions. By the time the workshop ended, Greg's head was spinning. He had spent the last several hours listening to people share their experiences. Stories of being followed in stores, of being overlooked for promotions, of assumptions made before a single word was spoken. And the worst part? He saw himself in all of it. As the attendees filtered out, Greg stayed in his seat, staring down at the notes he had taken. He barely noticed when Derek approached him. Well? Derek asked. Greg exhaled. That was a lot. Derek smirked. Yeah, it usually is. Greg looked up at him. How do you deal with it, knowing that people think like that? That I thought like that? Derek shrugged. You get used to it. But that doesn't mean it's okay. Greg nodded slowly. I don't know if I can fix this. Not just my reputation, but me. Derek studied him for a long moment before responding. You don't fix it overnight, but you start. And that's what matters. Greg let those words sink in. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Maybe he wasn't beyond saving. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Greg stood outside the training center, staring at the busy street in front of him. Cars whizzed by. People walked along the sidewalk, living their lives without a second thought. He had come into this workshop believing it was nothing more than a punishment, a box to check before disappearing into whatever came next. But now, something was different. He didn't know what to do with it yet, but the way he saw things was beginning to shift. Derek exited the building behind him, sliding his phone into his pocket. You look like a man who just found out the world isn't what he thought it was. Greg let out a dry chuckle. Something like that. Derek studied him for a moment. So, what are you going to do with it? Greg shook his head. No idea. Derek nodded. Fair enough. He glanced at his watch. I have a meeting downtown, but I'll be in touch. Greg watched as Derek walked away, disappearing into the city. He had spent years dismissing men like Derek, assuming they had nothing in common. Now he wasn't so sure. As Greg got into his car, his phone buzzed. It was Susan. Come home. We need to talk. Greg pulled into his driveway and sighed before stepping inside. Susan was in the living room, arms crossed, looking serious. He barely had time to speak before she hit him with the question, Are you actually changing, Greg? Or is this just damage control? Greg blinked. What? I saw the footage from today's workshop, she said, holding up her phone. It's all over the internet. People are actually saying you looked humbled. Greg scoffed. Well, that's a first. Susan wasn't amused. Greg, I need to know. Are you doing this just to fix your reputation? Or do you actually understand what's happening? Greg hesitated. I don't know yet. Susan's expression softened slightly. That's more honest than I expected. He ran a hand through his hair. Look, I spent my whole life thinking I was one thing, and now I'm realizing I might be another. It's a lot. Susan sat down, motioning for him to join her. I need you to understand something. This isn't just about what happened at the dealership. This is about the kind of man you are, the kind of father you are to our kids, the kind of example you're setting. Greg swallowed hard. He had spent so much time thinking about his career, his status. He hadn't thought about how this affected his family. I don't want our kids growing up thinking it's okay to judge people the way you did, Susan continued. I need to know that if you're changing, it's real. Greg nodded slowly. I think I'm starting to get it. Susan exhaled, looking relieved. Then prove it. The next morning, Greg woke up feeling restless. He had spent the night thinking about everything, his mistakes, his family, his future. He had no job, no plan. For the first time in years, he was forced to sit with himself. He grabbed his phone and, without thinking too much, called Derek. It rang 3 times before Derek picked up. Greg, I need to do something, Greg blurted. I don't know what yet, but I can't just sit here. I need to actually make this right. There was a pause. Then Derek said, Meet me downtown in an hour. Greg arrived at the address Derek had given him, a small community center in the heart of the city. He parked and walked inside, feeling out of place. Kids ran through the halls, parents chatted in small groups. The energy was warm, inviting. Derek greeted him near the entrance. Didn't think you'd actually show up? Greg let out a short laugh. Me neither. Derek led him into a large room where a group of young adults sat in a circle. Some were dressed casually, others in work uniforms. "This is a mentorship group," Derek explained. "People from all walks of life. Some looking for guidance, some just looking for a chance." Greg frowned. "Why am I here?" Derek smirked. "You want to make things right? Start here. Listen." Greg hesitated, then took a seat. A young man in his early 20s spoke first. "I got turned down for a job last week. They said they weren't hiring, but then my friend, who doesn't look like me, applied and got an interview the next day." A woman nodded. "That happens all the time." Another man added, "People see us and make up their minds before we even get a chance." Greg listened, his stomach twisting. He had been one of those people. When there was a pause, Derek looked at Greg. "Got anything to say?" Greg cleared his throat. "I don't know if I have the right to." One of the young men raised an eyebrow. "You're the guy from the news, aren't you? The dealership dude?" Greg winced. "Yeah." The room fell silent. Then someone asked, "What changed?" Greg thought about it. "I got caught," he admitted, "and it made me realize how blind I've been." The group exchanged glances. Then the young man who had recognized him said, "Well, at least you're here." Greg exhaled. Maybe, just maybe, he was on the right path. But he had no idea that his biggest test was still ahead, and it was coming sooner than he thought. Greg walked out of the community center with a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't quite relief, but it wasn't dread either. It was something new, something unfamiliar. Maybe it was growth. Derek stood beside him, watching the cars pass on the street. "Not bad for your first day," he said. Greg let out a breath. "I still don't know what I'm doing." "That's the point," Derek said. "It's not about having all the answers. It's about showing up." Greg nodded. But he knew this was only the beginning. He had spent years dismissing people, treating them like they weren't worth his time. One conversation wasn't going to change that overnight. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to answer. "Hello." A deep, steady voice spoke on the other end. "Mr. Sanders, this is Franklin Moore. I believe we need to talk." Greg frowned. Who?" The voice didn't hesitate. "I represent a legal team. You might want to sit down." Greg's stomach twisted. "Legal team? What is this about?" he asked. A pause. Then Franklin said, "A lawsuit. Against you." Greg sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. A lawsuit? His mind raced. Derek watched him from the sidewalk, eyebrows raised. "What's wrong?" Greg swallowed hard. "That was a lawyer." Derek frowned. "For what?" Greg shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I have a bad feeling about this." That evening, Greg sat in his living room, his laptop open in front of him. He had spent the last hour researching Franklin Moore, and what he found wasn't comforting. Moore was a well-known civil rights attorney who specialized in workplace discrimination cases. He had taken down entire corporations before. If he was involved, this wasn't small. His phone rang again. This time it was his former boss, Mark Hastings. Greg hesitated before answering. "Mark." "Greg," Mark said, his voice tight. "You've really done it now." Greg rubbed his temples. "What's going on?" Mark sighed. "That complaint Derek filed? Turns out he wasn't the only one. Since your little incident went public, we've had 3 more former customers come forward, and one of them lawyered up." Greg's heart dropped. Mark continued. "The dealership is being sued for discrimination, and guess whose name is front and center?" Greg felt like the room was closing in. "Me." "Damn right you," Mark snapped. "You put us in this mess, Greg, and now we're all going down with you." The line went dead. Greg stared at his phone, his hands shaking. This wasn't just about his career anymore. This was about his entire life. And now, it was in the hands of a lawyer who had every reason to make an example out of him. The next morning, Greg sat in a cold, sterile law office across from Franklin Moore himself. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through Greg. "I assume you understand the gravity of this situation," Franklin said, folding his hands on the desk. Greg exhaled. "I do." "Good." Franklin slid a folder across the desk. "Because here's what we're looking at: multiple complaints of racial discrimination, both from customers and former employees of Summit Auto. Patterns of bias. And Thanks to the media storm, a strong case in court, Greg's pulse pounded in his ears. Franklin leaned forward. Tell me, Mr. Sanders, do you think you can win this? Greg clenched his jaw. I don't know. Franklin nodded. Honest answer. I respect that. He glanced at the papers in front of him. Now, let's talk about your options. Greg braced himself. You can fight this, Franklin said. You can deny, argue, try to defend yourself in court. And let me tell you right now, you will lose. Public opinion is against you, and the evidence is strong. Greg swallowed hard. Or, Franklin continued, you could do something unexpected, something that might actually help. Greg frowned. What do you mean? Franklin leaned back. Settle, but not just with money. With action. Greg was confused. Action? Franklin nodded. Work with us. Help implement real change, not just at Summit Auto, but in the industry. Publicly acknowledge your mistakes. Stand up and be part of the solution. Greg hesitated. Franklin's gaze sharpened. You started this mess, Mr. Sanders. Now you have a chance to be on the right side of history. The question is, will you take it? Greg's heart pounded. He had never imagined his life would come to this. And now he had to make the biggest decision of his career, one that would define who he truly was. Greg sat in the law office, staring at Franklin Moore as the weight of his words settled over him. Settle. Publicly acknowledge his mistakes. Work toward real change. The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. His entire life had been built on power, control, and never backing down. Now he was being asked to surrender. No. To do something even harder. To change. Greg exhaled, rubbing his hands together. If I do this, he said slowly, what does it actually look like? Franklin studied him for a long moment before sliding another folder across the desk. If you settle, here's what we're proposing. A formal public statement admitting wrongdoing, an agreement to undergo extended bias training, and a long-term commitment to work with community organizations on diversity and inclusion efforts. You'll also be expected to speak about your experience at industry events, addressing discrimination in auto sales and beyond. Greg's stomach twisted. You want me to be the poster boy for racism? Franklin's eyes narrowed. I want you to take responsibility. Greg flinched at the sharpness in his voice. Franklin continued. Look, Mr. Sanders, you can fight this and lose everything, or you can own up to what you did and help fix the system you were a part of. You don't get to rewrite the past, but you do get to decide what comes next. Greg exhaled, gripping the edges of the folder. His mind screamed at him to fight, to deny, to push back like he always had. But his gut told him something else. For once in his life, he was listening. He flipped the folder open. Where do I sign? 2 days later, Greg sat in front of a row of cameras, a microphone in front of him, and a room full of reporters waiting for his words. He had been in front of cameras before, but never like this. Never with his back against the wall. Never with his entire identity being questioned. Derek stood off to the side, watching with his arms crossed. Greg wasn't sure if he was here as a supporter or a judge. Maybe both. The cameras clicked. The live stream was rolling. There was no turning back now. Greg cleared his throat. My name is Greg Sanders, he began, his voice steady but low. And I am here today because I made a mistake. No, because I made a series of mistakes, and I need to own them. Silence filled the room. He forced himself to meet the eyes of the journalists, the cameras, and finally, Derek. A few weeks ago, I turned away a customer in my dealership. I assumed he wasn't serious. I assumed he didn't belong. I made a judgment about him based on my own biases. Biases I didn't even realize I had. A murmur rippled through the room. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they were true. Greg took a deep breath and continued. I lost my job because of my actions. And at first, I thought that was the end of my story. But after a lot of difficult conversations, I realized that this wasn't just about me. This was about a system that allows people like me to make those assumptions without consequence. A system that has been hurting people for a long time. The cameras zoomed in. Greg clenched his hands. I can't change what I did, but I can do better, and I will. I am partnering with organizations that work to fight discrimination in the workplace. I am participating in training that will make me confront my own biases. And I will be working to make sure that what happened in that dealership doesn't happen again. not just to Derek Williams, but to anyone. He let out a slow breath. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect sympathy, but I do expect to be held accountable. And I will do whatever it takes to earn back the trust one lost. Silence. Then, questions exploded from the press. Mr. Sanders, do you think your actions reflect a larger issue in the auto industry? Are you doing this just to save face? Do you really think people can change? Greg held up a hand. I can't answer for the entire industry, and I don't expect people to believe me overnight. But I can promise you this. I'm not here to talk. I'm here to do the work. The room buzzed with energy. Greg had just taken the biggest risk of his life. Now he had to prove that it wasn't just words. After the press conference, Greg sat in a quiet corner of the venue, sipping a glass of water with shaking hands. Derek approached, hands in his pockets. Well, he said, you actually did it. Greg let out a dry laugh. Yeah, feels like I just jumped out of a plane without a parachute. Derek smirked. That's about right. He sat down across from Greg. I won't lie to you. Some people will never believe you. Some will think this is all an act. And some will never forgive you. Greg nodded. I know. Derek leaned in. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what you do next. Greg met his gaze. And what do you think I should do next? Derek studied him for a long moment before saying, keep showing up. Greg exhaled. For the first time in his life, he was no longer the man in control. And for the first time in his life, that didn't feel like a bad thing. But just as Greg began to feel like he was on the right path, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You may have fooled them, but we know who you really are. Watch your back. Greg's stomach dropped. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Greg stared at the message, his pulse pounding in his ears. You may have fooled them, but we know who you really are. Watch your back. The words seemed to burn into his screen, into his mind. Someone out there didn't believe in his redemption. And they weren't just watching, they were threatening. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. His first instinct was to delete the message, pretend he hadn't seen it. But no, this was different. This wasn't just online hate. This was personal. Slowly, he turned his phone toward Derek, who was still seated across from him. Derek read the text, his face darkening. Damn. Greg's voice came out hoarse. What do I do? Derek exhaled, rubbing his chin. First, we need to figure out who sent this. Have you been getting messages like this before? Greg shook his head. Not like this. Just angry comments online. People saying I deserve to lose my job. That I was only doing this to save myself. But this feels different. Derek nodded. You need to take this seriously. Let me make a call. He stood up, stepping away while dialing a number. Greg's hands tightened into fists. He had expected backlash. He knew people wouldn't believe in his change overnight. But this was something else. This was a direct threat, and he had no idea how far it would go. An hour later, Greg and Derek sat in a dimly lit office inside a security firm. A tall, muscular man with a buzz cut leaned against a desk, skimming through Greg's phone. His name was Marcus Tate, a former police investigator turned private security consultant. This message wasn't just some troll, Marcus said, handing the phone back. It was sent through an encrypted service. That means whoever sent it wanted to make sure it couldn't be traced easily. Greg's stomach tightened. So, what does that mean? Am I in danger? Marcus folded his arms. It's possible. Some people don't like when the status quo is challenged. And you? You went from being the guy people like them rooted for to the guy calling them out. That makes you a target. Greg's throat went dry. So what do I do? Marcus glanced at Derek. You keep an eye out. Don't ignore anything suspicious. And if you get another message, don't delete it. We need a pattern. Derek nodded. We'll be careful. Greg let out a shaky breath. Careful. That didn't exactly make him feel safe. Marcus studied him. Look, man, you did something most people don't do. You admitted you were wrong. That pisses some people off. But that doesn't mean you stop. You keep going. You keep proving them wrong. Greg nodded, but his mind was still spinning. Was this just an empty threat? Or was someone actually coming for him? And if they were, how far would they go? The next few days were tense. Greg continued his work, attending more training sessions, speaking with community leaders, even beginning to mentor young employees at Summit Auto. But the unease never left him. The messages didn't stop. At first, they came once a day. "We see you. This won't end well for you." Then, they became more specific. "Maybe your family should know the truth about who you really are." That one sent Greg into a panic. He hadn't told Susan about the threats yet. He didn't want to scare her, or worse, the kids. But when he arrived home that night and saw a black SUV idling down the street, his blood ran cold. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, watching. His hands shook as he locked the front door behind him. This was real, and whoever was behind it was getting closer. The following morning, Derek called Greg, his voice tense. "You need to get to my office. Now." Greg's stomach twisted. "What happened?" Derek hesitated. "It's not just you anymore." Greg rushed downtown, his heart pounding. When he arrived, Derek was waiting with a laptop open on his desk. "You're not the only one getting messages," Derek said, turning the screen toward Greg. Greg's eyes widened as he read the email. Subject: "You should have stayed quiet." Message: "You think this is just about one dealership? Think again. Keep pushing, and people will get hurt." Greg's mouth went dry. "They're threatening you too?" Derek nodded. "And others. Some of the people we've been working with. This isn't just about you anymore." Greg felt sick. He had started this thinking it was about his own redemption. Now, people were being dragged into the fire with him. "We need to take this to the authorities," Derek said. Greg hesitated. "What if it makes things worse?" Derek's eyes hardened. "It's already worse." Greg swallowed hard, nodding. They had crossed a line, and now they had to find out who was on the other side. That evening, Greg sat at the dinner table, barely touching his food. Susan watched him carefully. "You've been quiet," she said. Greg forced a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Susan put down her fork. Greg, he met her gaze, and in that moment, he knew he couldn't hide this anymore. "I've been getting threats," he admitted. Susan's face went pale. "What? From who?" Greg shook his head. "I don't know, but they're serious. And now, Derek and others are getting them too." Susan's eyes flashed with anger. "And you're just telling me this now?" "I didn't want to scare you," Greg said. Susan stood up, pacing. "Greg, we have kids. If someone is threatening you, they're threatening all of us." Greg's stomach clenched. He had tried to shield his family, but now he realized he might have put them in danger. He stood and grabbed her hands. "I swear, I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. We're taking this to the police. We're not backing down." Susan studied his face. "You really believe in this now, don't you?" Greg nodded. "I do." She exhaled, then gave a small nod. "Then we fight." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Greg's blood went cold. Susan's grip on his hand tightened. Slowly, Greg walked to the door. His heart pounded as he peered through the peephole. A man in a dark coat stood there, his face shadowed. Then he slid something under the door. A single envelope. Greg waited until the man walked away before picking it up. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a printed photo, a picture of his house, taken from the street, with the words scrawled in black ink. "This isn't over." Greg's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a threat anymore. This was a promise. Greg's hands shook as he stared at the photo. The message was clear. Whoever was behind this knew where he lived, knew his family. Susan gasped as she looked over his shoulder. "Oh my God!" Greg immediately turned to her. "Pack a bag, take the kids, and go to your sister's. Now." Susan hesitated, fear and anger flashing in her eyes. "Greg, please," he begged. "I don't know how far they'll go. I can't risk you or the kids being here." Susan swallowed hard but nodded. She knew this wasn't the time to argue. Within minutes, she had packed, scooped up the kids, and rushed out the door. Greg watched their car disappear down the street, his heart pounding. He had never felt fear like this before. But then, that fear turned to something else. Rage. Whoever was doing this thought they could scare him into silence. They thought they could stop him from making things right. They were wrong. Greg met Derek at the police station, where officers were already reviewing the threats. The detective assigned to their case, a stocky man named Detective Ruiz, tapped a pen against the table as he read through the messages. "This isn't just some internet troll," Ruiz said. "They're organized. They knew your routine. They knew where you live. That takes effort. Greg clenched his fists. Then find them. Ruiz nodded. We will. But in the meantime, you need to lay low. Derek scoffed. He can't. If he stops now, they win. Ruiz exhaled. You don't get it. These people don't play fair. If they feel threatened by what you're doing, they won't stop at just warnings. Greg met Derek's eyes. Then we keep going? Derek studied him for a moment, then nodded. The next few weeks were a blur of investigations, media attention, and security precautions. Greg's home was under police surveillance. His phone was tapped for any more threats. Derek's office installed security cameras. But through it all, they didn't stop. Greg continued speaking at events, pushing for change in the auto industry. Derek worked behind the scenes, strengthening policies against discrimination. And then, finally, a break. The police traced the threats to a small but powerful network of individuals, businessmen, former employees of Summit Auto, and even a few figures in law enforcement. People who wanted to keep the old ways in place. People who saw Greg's transformation as a betrayal. One by one, they were arrested. When Greg saw the names, he recognized some of them. One of them was his former boss, Mark Hastings. Greg sat in the courtroom as Mark was led inside in handcuffs. Their eyes met. And for the first time, Mark didn't look like the confident, powerful man he had once been. He looked small. Mark smirked bitterly. Never thought I'd see you sitting on that side of the courtroom. Greg's voice was steady. Yeah, well, things change. Mark laughed dryly. You think you did something? Huh? You think you actually changed the world? Greg exhaled. I changed myself. And that's a start. Mark scoffed, shaking his head. You really believe all this? Greg looked around the room. At Derek, at Angela, at the people who had stood by him when he decided to do the right thing. Then he looked at Mark, who had chosen the opposite path. I do, Greg said simply. Mark just shook his head, looking away. The judge entered, and the trial began. Months later, Greg stood in front of a crowd at a leadership conference, microphone in hand. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be standing here, he said, chuckling, I would have laughed in your face. A few laughs echoed in the room. But here's what I've learned. Change isn't easy. It's uncomfortable. It forces you to face parts of yourself you don't like. But it's possible. And it's necessary. He took a deep breath. I used to think my job defined me. My reputation. My power. But none of that matters if you don't stand for something. If you don't do the right thing. He looked out at the audience. I'm not a perfect man. I've made mistakes. But I'm trying. And if I can change, so can anyone. Applause filled the room. Derek, standing in the back, gave him a nod. Greg nodded back. It had been a long road, but he had finally found the man he wanted to be. And for the first time in his life, he was proud of that.